Hey guys, quick question. Do you believe there are things that sound straight up like creepypasta, but archaeology can actually pull real physical proof for like skull whistles that sound like someone screaming? Rivers of mercury sealed underground for 1,000 years that still leak poison. Entire cities sitting intact on the ocean floor like they're dodging history's rent. And this isn't the kind of stuff that's probably exaggerated or inspired by something. This is 30 times people dug into an impossible legend, expecting nothing but dirt and walked out with receipts. Bones, inscriptions, ruins, engineering, evidence so solid that lifelong skeptics just freeze. 1. You know those mysterious missing king stories that feel like a Netflix trailer? Richard III is that guy. After the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, he died, was buried fast, and then history started messing around. Rumors went everywhere, thrown into a river hidden away so he wouldn't become a symbol, the usual dramatic package. But the truth is, way more brutally ordinary, he was under a parking lot. Yep, a king of England spent decades with cars parked over him. If the afterlife has customer service, Richard probably filed a complaint because that twist is ridiculous. And when archaeologists finally dug, they didn't just find bones. They found the right person in the right place with the right historical fingerprints, a curved spine that matched descriptions, battle injuries, and the big, closer science doing the show me, the receipt moment. DNA matched him to living maternal line relatives. That's it. No fortune tellers, no mystical legends, no I can sense royal energy. Just a parking lot and a lab. Sometimes history isn't mysterious, it's just missing a signpost. 2. Some things make you ask, who came up with this and why were they still funded? With the Aztecs, the answer is simple: war. Their legends talked about warriors carrying the scream of the dead into battle. Historians smirked poetic trash talk, ancient people loved hype. Sure, until archaeology started pulling out clay whistles shaped like human skulls from burial sites in Mexico. They look small, almost cute in a Halloween souvenir kind of way. Then someone finally goes, okay, let's blow into it, and the room instantly switches from academic vibes to horror movie vibes. What comes out isn't a flute note. It isn't a normal whistle. It sounds disturbingly close to a human, screaming in pain like you want to turn the volume down, even though you're standing in real life. Now picture not one, hundreds. An entire line of warriors is charging while blasting that sound at the same time. You haven't even drawn your sword and you're already reconsidering your career. Ancient psychological warfare didn't need amplifiers. It just needed vicious acoustic design and an army willing to commit. The Aztecs didn't just weaponize blades. They weaponized fear, and this time you hear the evidence and you believe it. 3. There was a time when mentioning the Hittites got you the look, oh, that's in the Bible, right? So, legend. A lot of scholars used to think the same thing because outside a few ancient texts, there was nothing solid. No cities, no palaces, no paperwork. A whole empire with almost no physical footprint sounds suspicious, like a superpower nobody remembers the address for. Then people started digging at Hattusa in modern-day Turkey, and history immediately changed its tone. Massive walls, lion gates, temples, storage buildings. A scale that screams, this is not a tribe passing through, but the hardest slap came from something small, tens of thousands of clay tablets. Diplomatic letters laws, tribute lists, and administrative records. In plain terms, invoices, memos, and meeting notes are the ancient versions. Suddenly, the Hittites went from a cameo in old stories to a Bronze Age superpower in Egypt. The problem wasn't that they didn't exist. The problem was we forgot them really, really well. Archaeology just pulled out the files, put them on the table, and stamped them confirmed. 4. The Vikings had a legend that sounds like a video game item, sunstones crystals that let you find the sun even through heavy clouds or fog. Most people hear that and nod like, sure, sailors tell stories, so they don't panic. Then science walks in like the person who ruins the magic trick and says it's not magic. It's physics. A crystal like Iceland spar polarizes light. In simple terms, even when you can't see the sun, the sky still carries its light signature. Hold the crystal up, rotate it, and the brightness shifts depending on where the sun is. From that, you can infer the sun's position. No GPS, no fancy compass, just a rock and a navigator with confidence. The best part is that people used to call it superstition when it's actually a practical navigation tool for the cloudy North Atlantic. The magic stone didn't lose its power. It just got its real name, an optical tool ancient people used successfully long before we invented the explanation. Vikings didn't need a physics textbook. They needed to get home. 5. Sodom and Gomorrah is the kind of story where everyone knows the ending, corrupt city, angry heaven fire and brimstone like a blockbuster finale. Great for a sermon. Awkward for anyone who wants evidence. Then archaeologists dug at Tal el Hammam, a Bronze Age city in Jordan, and the vibe shifted from legend to hold on. In the destruction layer, pottery looks flash melted. Materials are warped as they run through a furnace. Human bones are shattered and scattered in patterns that look like an extreme blast. The soil shows salt and sulfur, an agricultural nightmare combo. The leading idea is an airburst event, a meteor or comet fragment exploding in the atmosphere, creating a shockwave and insane heat in seconds. No divine laser beam required, just physics showing up at the worst possible time. If salt got blasted across the land, it also explains why the area could become unfarmable for ages. So fire from the sky might not be a metaphor. It could be survivors describing a disaster they didn't have the vocabulary to name. 6. You think the oracle at Delphi was Apollo whispering cosmic cheat codes into kings' ears. The real story is less divine but honestly funnier because it actually makes sense. The legend says that the priestess the Pythia sat in the temple and hailed sacred vapors rising from the earth and delivered prophecies vague enough that everyone could claim they were right. Skeptics said it was all theater incense drama and professional-level double talk. Then geology showed up with no incense, just fault line maps. Researchers found intersecting faults directly beneath the oracle chamber, the kind that can release natural gases. One candidate people often mention is ethylene, slightly sweet-smelling, and in low doses can cause dizziness, euphoria, and trance-like states. In other words, the Pythia didn't have to be possessed by a god. She might have been possessed by gas. Suddenly, the ancient descriptions line up, shaking a strange voice, tangled words, and then priests interpreting it for paying customers. Whether Apollo spoke is up to you, but the rock underneath definitely helped write the script. Sometimes magic is just science waiting for a label, and Delphi was very good at charging admission. 7. On Flores Island in Indonesia, locals told stories about the Ebu Gogo, little hairy people who lived in caves, stole food, and babbled like children. Folklorists politely nodded and filed it under cute local mythology, no need to worry. In 2003, that file drawer got yanked open. In Liang Bua cave, archaeologists found the skeletal remains of a tiny human species about 3 feet tall with a small skull and distinct features now known as Homo floresiensis. Not elves, not fairy tale dwarves. Actual neighbors who existed long enough to end up in oral tradition. So there are little people in the mountains wasn't a bedtime scare line, it was a field report everyone ignored. The funny part is how modern people love to assume they're the smart ones and locals are the superstitious ones. Sometimes locals are just doing population reporting in their own language. The takeaway is simple. When people on an island tell you steady word in that there are little humans in the forest, don't laugh. Write it down. Bring a flashlight. And maybe bring snacks too, because they might still be into stealing food. 8. Ancient Greek and Egyptian sources mentioned Heracleion, also called Thonis, as a wealthy port city at the mouth of the Nile, where ships packed in like rush hour traffic, and even the gods would have had to take a number. Then it vanished off the map. Later scholars looked around, found nothing, and made the most academic conclusion possible: ancient writers were exaggerating again. The problem is that the sea doesn't read peer review. Off the coast near Alexandria, underwater archaeologists pulled up proof from the mud: massive statues, temple columns, inscriptions, gold coins, anchors, shipwrecks, and foundations sitting quietly under sediment. It wasn't an imaginary city. It just changed its address to the bottom of the Mediterranean. Earthquakes, subsidence, and seawater turned the ground into something like pudding, and the whole city slid down in silence. The beauty of Heracleion is that the evidence is instantly readable. You don't place a 16-foot statue underwater and call it a metaphor. The lost city legend was missing one step: look down, not far away. Sometimes archaeology is less detective work and more deep-sea salvage. 9. Everyone knows Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants, the kind of trivia you flex in a quiz game. What historians fought about for over 2,000 years was one tiny question: which pass did he take? People wrote books, drew maps, and argued hard enough to deserve an actual academic arguing championship. Then a team of scientists decided to skip the poetry and look for something that can't lie poop. Yes, they went hunting for the biological footprint of an army of around 60,000 men, plus horses, plus a few dozen elephants, which would absolutely leave behind souvenirs. They found a sediment layer loaded with animal dung in the suspected area, and it dated to roughly Hannibal's era. No legendary sword required. No lost manuscript. Just the reality that the bigger the army, the bigger the bathroom problem. Sometimes history isn't solved with space-age tech. Sometimes it's solved by asking a very human question: where did everyone go to the bathroom? And once you find that answer, the mystery route shows up like a road sign, except this one probably smelled terrible. 10. Rome used to carry itself like a guaranteed winner. Disciplined legions, shiny armor-straight roads, and the belief that forests were basically just places to harvest wood. Then in 9 CE, they marched into the Teutoburg forest and discovered the forest had opinions. The story says 3 legions got ambushed and shredded in rain mud and narrow paths where Roman formations couldn't even pretend to look impressive. Centuries later, it reads like a moral lesson. Don't get cocky, especially while wearing heavy armor. At Calcrease, archaeology doesn't tell the story with speeches, it lays out the evidence like lost property. Coins, spearheads, arrowheads, military gear, human bones, and traces of fortifications spread along a long corridor, exactly the pattern you'd expect from a force being chased and broken in chaos, not fighting a neat set-piece battle. There's even evidence of a low earthen wall, enough for Germanic fighters to hide behind and turn the legions into moving targets. The takeaway is brutal. No empire is too strong to slip in the mud. Teutoburg didn't just break a battle, it redirected Rome's ambitions in Germania with guerrilla tactics in a forest that did not care about Roman branding. 11. El Dorado is the most successful historical scam of all time. The Spanish heard rumors about a city of gold in the New World and their eyes lit up like headlights. They spent years slogging through jungle and swamps, fighting mosquitoes, and each other chasing an address that didn't exist. The problem was simple. They translated it wrong. El Dorado wasn't a place at first. It was a person, specifically the new leader of the Muisca. During his coronation, he was covered in gold dust, stepped onto a raft out onto Lake Guadavita, then washed it off and tossed offerings into the water. Picture a man glittering like a living gold statue, and you'll understand why that rumor spread faster than a virus. The wild part is this story isn't just plausible. In 1969, a famous gold artifact was found, a raft depicting that exact ceremony with a central figure and attendants standing around him. Evidence like that doesn't need a long explanation. It says it straight, the ritual was real. Europeans just turned one religious moment into a gold real estate frenzy. They hunted a city when the city was actually a ritual that lasted a few minutes. 12. For centuries, the Iliad sat on the same shelf as divine mythology. Fun to read, not meant to be true. A 10-year war over one-woman heroes chatting with gods, a giant wooden horse. It sounds more like fan fiction than history. Then a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann showed up with enough enthusiasm to make academics sigh. He said he'd find Troy. They laughed. He dug. At Hisarlik in Turkey, Schliemann and later teams found not one Troy but multiple Troys stacked like a layer cake. Walls, houses, ash destruction, then rebuilding again and again. One layer lines up in date and conflict signals with the late Bronze Age timeframe tied to the Trojan War tradition, suggesting a major catastrophe right around when the legend places it. Meaning Homer didn't invent the location. He was talking about a real place with a real violent past, then adding literary seasoning to make it go down easier. Whether the wooden horse happened exactly like that is still debated. But the big point is locked in. Troy was real, it was destroyed, and the legend grabbed onto an event big enough to survive for millennia. 13. If there were a competition for most unhinged flex in history, Caligula would be a finalist. Ancient writers claimed he had floating pleasure palaces on Lake Nemi, party barges with marble floors, hot baths, and plumbing like a luxury hotel. Scholars raised an eyebrow. Ancient Rome building floating villas. Sounds like gossip designed to roast a famously unstable emperor. Then in the 1920s, Mussolini decided to do something extremely Mussolini and drained the entire lake. Out of the mud came 2 massive ships, each over 200 feet long, basically 2 buildings that could float stuck in time. Inside were mosaic floors, baths, bronze fittings, water systems, and engineering so sophisticated you start wondering if this was a party boat or an empire on a hull. That's the moment Roman rumor turned into an incident report. Caligula didn't just have boats. He had floating mansions for hosting parties simply because he could. Sadly, both ships were destroyed during World War II, but the photos and recovered materials were more than enough to seal the argument shut. 14. The desert has a classic magic trick: swallow a city, and then act like nobody ever lived there. That's why the story of Ubar or Iram of the Pillars got filed for a long time as the Atlantis of the Sands, cool, dramatic, hard to verify. The legend says it was a wealthy, arrogant city that was punished and vanished without a trace. The twist came from the least romantic thing possible: data. Satellite imagery showed ancient caravan routes converging on a single point in the Omani Desert. When archaeologists dug there, they found a fortified settlement with walls and towers, exactly what you'd expect from a trade hub controlling the frankincense routes. And the vanishing turned out not to be a curse, but geology. Limestone can form voids, collapse into a sinkhole, and drag structures down with it. No wrath required, just the ground deciding to open up. So the legend gets an update. Ubar didn't fly away, it fell in. The desert doesn't just bury memory, it preserves records for a very long time if you know where to look from above and where to dig. 15. Before archaeology stepped in, the Shang dynasty was like that ancestor in a family tree everyone swears exists. Ancient Chinese texts list kings, rituals, and wars in detail, but scholars used to hesitate because the physical proof wasn't there. Then farmers near Anyang dug up what looked like trash ox bones and turtle shells covered in strange carved symbols. They were oracle bones, the royal court's divination tools. The Shang carved questions onto bone, heated it until it cracked, then read the cracks like scrolling comments, "Will it rain today? Who should we fight? Will the queen's birth go okay?" Sounds superstitious, but the crucial part is the writing. Once decoded, researchers found king lists and lineages matching traditional records with uncanny accuracy. Not just a couple of names for fun, but whole systems of rituals, campaigns, and place names. In other words, the Shang left behind government paperwork on bone more durable than paper hard to fake and buried underground waiting for someone to read it. A dynasty once suspected of being too neat to be real suddenly became history with signatures, seals, and receipts. 16. Ancient Greeks loved telling stories about the Amazons, women warriors on horseback, shooting bows, fighting like men, and making men panic because they didn't know whether to call them my lady or my opponent. For a long time, scholars treated it as Greek anxiety about gender roles packaged as myth entertaining, but probably not real. Then archaeologists opened Scythian burial mounds across the Eurasian steppe and found something awkward for anyone who likes neat conclusions. The graves held women, and they weren't buried with hairpins. They were buried with swords, spears, bows, daggers, and horse gear. Some skeletons show healed wounds, meaning they survived real combat. Many had leg bones shaped by riding from a young age, not trying it once for fun. This wasn't decoration for a ceremony. It was a professional kit. Suddenly, Herodotus, the guy everyone loves to accuse of exaggerating, starts looking less like a storyteller and more like someone taking notes. The Amazons might not have been as cinematic as the myths, but women who actually fought was real, and the ground kept the evidence so they wouldn't have to argue. Next time someone says only men went to war in the ancient world, you can tell them, go ask the graves. 17. Before you call ancient people low-tech, remember they drilled through a mountain like they had GPS installed in their brains. On the island of Samos in the 6th century BCE, an engineer named Eupalinos was tasked with bringing clean water to the city. His solution was not gentle, cut a tunnel more than a kilometer long, straight through the mountain, and dug from both ends at the same time. It sounds cool, but anyone who's ever drilled a hole to hang a picture knows you're off by a few degrees and you're accidentally renovating your neighbor's house. And yet the tunnel of Eupalinos is still there. The two crews met almost perfectly with only a small correction near the end. Inside, you can see the water channel, the arched ceiling, and signs of serious organization. This was a managed project, not let's see what happens. What really irritates modern people is what they didn't have: no lasers, no total stations, no angle measuring app. They used geometry, plumb lines experience, and a level of confidence we mostly associate with keyboard warriors. When Herodotus described it, some people assumed he was exaggerating. The mountain didn't exaggerate. The mountain kept the receipt in stone. 18. Northern sailors described the Kraken as a tentacled nightmare. Something huge rises up, wraps a ship, and drags it down like the ocean flushing a toilet. Researchers used to laugh it off sailor stories. Too little sleep, too much alcohol, congratulations, you've invented a monster. The thing is, the ocean doesn't need you to believe. It keeps raising real nightmares. Giant squid exist, and they are not cute. Adults can reach enormous lengths with dinner plate eyes and arms lined with powerful suckers. The proof doesn't come from poetry. It comes from sperm whales. Whales' surface is covered in circular scars that match the size and pattern of giant squid suckers, like they just had a fight in the deep and lost an argument. Every so often, a giant squid carcass washes ashore or turns up in fishing gear, confirming that the scale isn't imagination. Could a squid sink a warship like a movie? Probably not. But imagine being a medieval sailor on a dark deck, and a shadow the length of a bus slides past you under the water. Are you calling that a large squid or a sea demon exactly? The legend wasn't pure invention. It just added sound effects. 19. Percy Fawcett, a British explorer, walked into the Amazon with an idea guaranteed to cause suffering. He believed a major civilization had been swallowed by the jungle, a place he called the City of Z. The world responded with the adult smiling at a kid look. The Amazon is wet, sick, and ruled by mosquitoes. There are no cities in there. Fawcett vanished in 1925, and that only thickened the legend. Then modern survey work started peeling back the green. Using satellite imagery and terrain data, researchers began spotting straight lines that nature doesn't usually draw: earthworks, ditches, embankments, raised roads, plazas, and linked clusters of settlements. In multiple regions, the patterns suggest planned communities, agriculture, and complex social organization. Not a city of gold, but definitely not a few huts either. The irony is that the jungle hides so well that outsiders assumed there was nothing, then decided locals must be telling stories for fun. In reality, people were living on top of history under a thick green blanket. City of Z might not match the exact map in Fawcett's head, but the core idea: lost urban landscapes in the Amazon, is real. The Amazon isn't empty, it's just extremely good at keeping secrets. 20. Herodotus once wrote that the Scythians were covered in tattoos of animals and mythical creatures, as if they rode horses while carrying an entire zoo on their skin. A lot of readers nodded and moved on because there were no photos, no video, and Herodotus has a reputation for getting a little carried away. Then the Siberian weather showed up as the most annoying witness imaginable. Permafrost did what history rarely gets to do: it preserved skin. When the Pazyryk burial mounds were excavated, frozen mummies emerged with their skin intact, and on that skin were tattoos so intricate you have to remind yourself they're over 2,000 years old. Deer, leopards, griffins, fish geometric patterns wrapped around arms and legs like a biological map drawn by a skilled artist, not a few random ink marks. This wasn't barbaric superstition. It was art composition, technique, taste. Suddenly, Herodotus goes from talks too much to basically taking minutes. The funny part is people called him an exaggerator, and then the frozen dead showed up as witnesses. When the ice gives up its secrets, history runs out of excuses. 21. The Minotaur story sounds like a movie pitch: a half-man, half-bull monster trapped in a labyrinth. Anyone who goes in gets lost, and one hero saves the day with brains and a ball of string. Easy to file under myth because nobody is keeping a bull-headed roommate in the basement and still getting invited to neighborhood dinners. But the labyrinth part is different. When Arthur Evans excavated Knossos on Crete, he found a palace unlike anything most ancient Greeks would have known. Hundreds, maybe over 1,000 rooms overlapping corridors, multiple level staircases that dead-end doors connecting to doors like an architect designed it as a competitive hide-and-seek map. Walk in once and you immediately understand why visitors said the place could swallow people. No magic required, just a layout that overloads your brain. Add in Minoan culture's obsession with bulls, wall paintings, sacred objects, bull-leaping rituals, and you get the perfect recipe. A real maze plus real bull symbolism and imagination does the rest. The Minotaur might be special effects, but the labyrinth had an actual address, actual walls, actual doors, and plenty of reasons to keep that string handy. 22. Qin Shi Huang's tomb comes with an environmental horror legend. A miniature empire underground complete with rivers of mercury flowing like water so the emperor can keep ruling below the surface. It sounds ridiculous. Dumping mountains of mercury into a sealed tomb would be expensive and dangerous, like committing to ruling to the very end in the most literal way possible. Then science shows up in its cold, practical mode: don't dig, recklessly measure. Researchers sampled soil around the burial mound and found mercury levels way higher than the natural baseline. You can argue about whether it's shaped like a river, but numbers don't do improv. If there isn't a large mercury source inside, it's hard to explain that kind of contamination persisting for over 2,000 years. That's one reason the main chamber is still largely unopened. Preservation matters, but safety does too. Mercury isn't a prop. So the Mercury River story changes status from wild rumor to a chemically grounded possibility. Ancient writers might have added seasoning, but the core of the legend stands on data. Sometimes what you need isn't faith. It's a field meter and a mask. 23. Pontius Pilate used to be the kind of figure you only met in religious texts, and anyone who wanted real-world evidence could shrug. No Roman records, no statues, no coins, no nameplates, so maybe he was just a convenient character to blame. It's a tempting idea. History gets written like a script sometimes, and scripts love a clear villain in an official title. Then in 1961 at Caesarea, Maritima archaeologists excavating a Roman theater found a limestone block that had been reused as building material. Ancient people recycled too, they just recycled dedication stones. On it was a Latin inscription naming Pontius Pilate and identifying him as prefect of Judea. Not a story, not a rumor. An official inscription, basically a government memo carved into stone. That's the moment a man some people treated as possibly fictional steps out of scripture and into the empire's paperwork. The twist is that the evidence sat around for nearly 2,000 years, flipped over, and was stuffed into a wall. Pilate didn't vanish. He got turned into a brick. Case closed. 24. Suetonius wrote that Nero had a dining room that rotated day and night like the heavens, and plenty of readers laughed it off as a literary shade, another way to paint an emperor as decadent and ridiculous. Then Rome got dug through like an old junk drawer, and archaeologists found circular foundations and mechanical traces suggesting the idea wasn't just poetic. There's evidence of a ring-like structure and a system that could move the floor using hydraulics, water, and pressure to keep the platform turning. In other words, Nero didn't need social media to flex. He made the room spin so every guest could feel like the universe revolved around their dinner. The funny part is how often we assume ancient people were technologically limited right up until they hand us a design that makes modern engineers go quiet for a second. Yes, it was luxury, but it was also real engineering, very Roman, and perfectly suited to a court with money labor and a boss who believed even physics should serve the meal. So next time an ancient source says an emperor did something absurd, don't rush to laugh. Sometimes they're just reporting, and we're the ones lacking imagination. 25. Before the evidence showed up, Vikings reaching North America sounded like the kind of brag you hear in a bar. We got there before Columbus, trust me. The sagas say Leif Erikson sailed west from Greenland to a land called Vinland, with decent weather and plenty of resources. The rest of Europe shrugged because sea stories usually come with extra seasoning. Then in 1960, at Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland, archaeology planted a stake that's hard to argue with. Turf buildings built in a Norse style, iron rivets, a bronze cloak pin, evidence of iron working something that doesn't just naturally grow in the soil. This wasn't a random lost object. It was a stopover site, a place to repair camp and stay long enough to leave behind trash. And trash is always honest, so Vikings in America moved from bar talk to history around the year 1000, nearly 500 years before Columbus. The funniest part is that they got there early and never built the brand. No lasting colony, no PR campaign, no invitations sent to Europe. They showed up, told the story in sagas, and went quiet. The world took a few hundred years to catch the signal. History isn't short on people who arrive first. It's just short on marketing. 26. The Maya didn't vanish because someone cursed them, even if legends love blaming angry gods. The real question is, how does a civilization with writing astronomy pyramids and a dense network of city-states collapse around the 9th century? The theories were a buffet war rebellion disease, bad leadership, and even aliens if you're on the wrong channel. Then climate science walked in and said, look at the caves. Inside caves, stalagmites and stalactites grow in mineral layers like tree rings. The chemistry of each layer records rainfall. When researchers read this stone diary, they saw a run of megadroughts lasting decades, with periods where rainfall dropped sharply right when Maya cities depended heavily on seasonal agriculture. You don't need invaders if the sky turns off the faucet. The darkly funny takeaway is that they could calculate eclipses, but they couldn't negotiate with the weather. The gods are angry might have just been their word for climate, and the quietest thing in the story, a stalagmite ends up being the clearest record. 27. Everyone knows the sword and the stone trope from King Arthur. Pull the sword, become the king, dramatic music kicks in. But in Tuscany, Italy, there's a version that makes you stop mid-step. Nobody pulled it because it's still there. At the Montesiepi Chapel, a sword has been driven straight into a rock since the 12th century, linked to Saint Galgano, a violent knight who supposedly turned his life around. He didn't write an apology letter. He stuck his sword into the stone to say, "I'm done with war." It sounds like a tourist prop, so of course people suspected a setup. The analyses of the metal and forging style match 12th century workmanship. The break and contact points show no signs of welding or fake attachment. In other words, someone really did drive a sword into solid rock. And it's been sitting there for over 800 years under protective glass, keeping curious hands from trying their luck. The irony is that Arthur might be a legend, but the Italian sword is painfully real. Sometimes the world flips fairy tales are hard to prove, while something that sounds like a fairy tale is sitting right in front of you. Silent and extremely solid. 28. If you want to see a city that basically turned invisible, Cambodia is the perfect example. Everyone knows Angkor is spectacular, but for decades the surrounding urban landscape felt locked up by rainforest. Standing under the canopy, all you see is green and mosquitoes offering commentary while roads, canals, and neighborhoods disappear to the naked eye. So a lot of people assumed Angkor was just a cluster of temples for photo ops. Then LiDAR showed up like leaf-penetrating vision mode. Airborne lasers mapped the ground in crazy detail, and suddenly the pattern popped long straight roads, embankments, reservoirs, canals, house platforms, and settlement clusters linked like a working system. This wasn't just a temple complex, it was a full urban network with infrastructure and water management that kept an entire region alive through the dry season. The rainforest didn't erase Angkor, it just put a camouflage blanket over it. LiDAR pulled that blanket off and left a map so clear that you immediately understand how the Khmer could dominate such a huge area. 29. Julius Caesar describes his campaigns in Gaul with the voice of a man who just won a war and is also doing his own publicity. Later generations were right to be skeptical. He had every reason to make everything sound bigger. One debated point is clashes with Germanic groups in what's now the Netherlands. The stories are intense, but where's the ground-level proof? At Kessel, the answer didn't come from speeches. It came from what was sitting in the soil. Archaeologists found human remains with signs of violence weapons and Roman military gear alongside finds dated to the late 1st century BCE. More importantly, it wasn't neatly contained in a cemetery. The material was scattered across the landscape like the footprint of a chaotic pursuit. The more pieces you connect, the less it looks like a clean battle, and the more it looks like a massacre. So the story shifts. Caesar may have polished certain details, but he didn't invent mudblood and twisted metal. Cold ground just keeps what falls into it, then hands it back like a receipt shoved into a pocket for 2,000 years. 30. If Atlantis is the story that fascinates people and frustrates them because nobody can point to it on a map, Helaik is the Greek version that plays it straight, a real location, ancient references, and a geological explanation. Ancient accounts say Helaik was wealthy, devoted to Poseidon, and then one night an earthquake hit the sea, rushed in, and the city vanished like it got yanked off the map. It sounds like a warning, don't irritate the sea god. But later people only saw farmland, so the story got filed under salty mythology. Then archaeology showed up with no trident, just shovels and instruments. Near Aegean researchers found foundations buried under sediment-broken pottery and layers of mud and sand dumped fast, consistent with a major flooding event. The destruction layers suggest something sudden and powerful, matching an earthquake with a tsunami or soil liquefaction. The disappearance didn't need magic. The ground dropped, the water covered it, and that was that. Helaik is a reminder that some legends sound like moral lessons, but are really disaster reports. Dig in the right place and the earth tells the story more clearly than any narrator. 30 legends confirmed with the proof. And I'll bet we still missed a few. Now it's your turn. What story from your country or your culture sounds so ridiculous that people laugh but later turned out to have real evidence behind it? Drop it in the comments and call us out if we left it off. If this video made you believe the ancients weren't always making things up, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.